Welcome back. In the previous episodes, we've discussed the specifics of the MSX standard, its diffusion worldwide, and had a brief glance at some games. Now it's time to delve deeper into these and detail the different types of games available for the MSX. We'll run them directly from original hardware, so prepare for a lot of genuine gameplay, just like was the case back then in the 1980s. This tour will mainly focus on those games I played myself back in the day, but we'll also mention a few other notable ones that I wasn't fortunate enough to get or to know as a kid. The MSX standard was announced in 1983, at about the same time as Nintendo's Famicom, so that Japanese game design was to skyrocket in the following years. Let's begin with games developed specifically for the MSX standard, or direct conversions from arcade, and then speak about ports of well-known titles from other platforms, computers, or consoles. As opposed to ports from other systems, MSX dedicated games were mainly published on cartridges. This format was largely proprietary, meaning that games were most often developed and published by the same company, almost always a Japanese one. Companies such as ASCII, HAL, Hudson Soft, and of course Konami developed and published games directly for the MSX. As a result, there were hundreds of MSX-only games, or that were developed for the MSX and only then ported elsewhere. Let's first consider the most popular editors and then the others. First and foremost among MSX game publishers, Konami released many of their arcade hits along with entirely new games, covering almost every possible genre: sports, platform, shooter, adventure, reflection. They really had something for everyone. The Hyper Sports and Hyper Olympics, also named Track and Field series, allowed you to try 3 different athletic competitions per title, usually 3 to 5. These were simple but very successful games. Hyper Olympic was one of my first ones. I got it along with the computer itself, and in a sense it was a pity because I almost broke down the direction keys, hitting them like mad as I thought was required to move your character faster. Actually, you just had to toggle between them repeatedly and the most quickly as possible, which could have been less harmful to the keys had I known it. But what can you say? I was just an ignorant kid so eager to discover video games on my first home computer. Then there were many other sports games released individually: tennis, ping pong, soccer, boxing, and others. One of the great interests of those games was, of course, that you could play with someone else, either against him or in collaboration. I remember playing very enjoyable tennis doubles, and when you had no joystick, then both players had to use their own corner of the keyboard. We can add Athleticland and Circus Charlie to the sports category. Athleticland was among my very first games for the MSX, and one that I greatly enjoyed. It proposed several basic obstacles: lake, rock, cubes, fountains, and then as you progressed through its levels, they were mixed together with additional difficulties: flying bee, bouncing ball, leaping fishes, and so on. In Circus Charlie, you control a little clown through 5 different acrobatic levels: the fire wheel, the tightrope, the rolling ball, the running horse and trampoline, and finally, the trapeze. Sweet little game, ideal for a 7-year-old. On a little more violent note, the Yie Ar Kung Fu series put you against different opponents inside a classic Chinese setting. Rather sober in the first, but very beautiful in the second episode. As in many Konami titles, the music was memorable. Racing games included classic settings like in Hyper Rally, where you had to progress through different road environments and rank as required at every level. A long, but rather easy game. Or less common settings as in F1 Spirit and Road Fighter, which offered a view from the top and where programmers found tricks to produce a more or less smooth scrolling on a machine that notoriously lacked this ability. We can also add an original one to this category, Antarctic Adventure, since it's also a race against time, except that you control a penguin instead of a car. Skating on ice, leaping over holes and crevices while catching fishes. Pintaro the Penguin must complete his tour of the Antarctic with your help. What a lovable little game. And it had a sequel, Penguin Adventure, in which Pintaro must save the penguin princess by rushing up through different stages, not only ice, but pretty much every possible landscape. Green or frosty forest, cave, ice shelf, river, desert, frozen sea, and underwater. These are full of dangers and enemies that make this race even more difficult. This time, fishes serve as coins to buy items or to bet in slot machines. And if you're lucky enough, you will even take a tour in space. The shooter category was one of the most developed. It included Konami's very first releases, Time Pilot and Super Cobra, which were already something as compared to what you could get in 1983. And the craft of the programmers soon allowed more elaborated games like Twin B, and then the legendary ones, the Nemesis and Salamander series. Gradius was ported to the MSX from arcade under the name Nemesis at the same time as it was to the Nintendo NES. Although the latter was closer to the original version, the MSX one was also very good. Its main drawback was the absence of scrolling capabilities on this machine, but all the rest was fairly enjoyable. I remember trying over and over again this very hard shoot 'em up. Whereas the first two levels were rather easy, things began to look pretty bad in the Moaj Heads levels, and even more so in the Skeletons levels. I still made it to the last one, but the stress was so intense. The next episodes, Nemesis 2 and 3, were even more awesome games, and same thing for Salamander, which also gave me nightmares as I wore down my keyboard through its insanely difficult levels. This was one of the few game cartridges to include an SCC sound chip, which provided 5 additional channels of wavetable sound. The resulting music was really something. Knightmare was not a space, but a medieval shooter. The warrior Popolon was to rescue Aphrodite at the end of 5 long and difficult levels with vertical scrolling. While on its way, he could improve his weapons and get various temporary abilities represented by chess figures that lay on the ground. Just as in other MSX shooter games, sprite animation was impeccable, but scrolling wasn't smooth at all. As for the music and sound effects, it was absolutely awesome. Along with Nemesis, Knightmare was the very first Konami foray into something more complex that made the best possible use of the MSX capabilities. It was quite an achievement for its time. When I got it back in 1986, I can tell you that I didn't see anything like this before. There were various platform games, some simple, like Magical Tree, where you basically had to climb all the way up tall trees full of angry owls and other things. Others, like the Goonies, contained a little more strategy, since you needed to find keys to deliver your companions. And even more so in the Kings Valley series, where you had to solve extremely complex puzzles while avoiding enemies to finally find a way to the exit doors. One of my friends at the time, to whom I lent my MSX with all my games, was so fascinated by Kings Valley 2 that he didn't play anything else for the whole month, and he eventually made it to the end, something I deemed impossible to do. The Maze of Galious deserves a special mention. This was definitely one of the greatest games of all. It was also called Knightmare 2, but it had little in common with the first one except the main character, Popolon. And while the aim of the first was to rescue his beloved Aphrodite, the goal of the sequel was to rescue their baby. But whereas Knightmare was basically just a shooter, the Maze of Galious resembled a platform game, but was in fact an adventure one with some RPG elements. These were really basic. You could gain experience by fighting monsters, and thus level up and increase your overall resilience. That was it, but that was enough to define basic roleplay. And then, of course, the usual Zelda-like adventure ingredients: magical objects, helpful encounters, portals to different underworlds, and so on. The soundtrack remains one of the best remembered among all MSX games, and that's not an easy record because there were many great ones. Some games are hard to categorize other than just action. Frogger was one of the very first titles from Konami adapted from the mythical arcade game. Monkey Academy was at the boundary between platform and reflection, since you needed to solve mathematical problems to progress. In Comic Bakery, you need to ensure that pastries move all the way along the factory line while fighting malicious and hungry raccoons which try to eat them and to switch off your machines. You have a limited time to deal with that nuisance before loading the truck and drive off to deliver pastries to your customers. A very enjoyable scenario that resembles the first Mario Factory one. Overall, it's safe to say that Konami games were by far the best known to any MSX owner and remain historically associated with the standard. I hope you enjoyed this video. You can support the channel on Patreon to keep them coming. Don't forget to subscribe if not already the case. Write in the comments your wishes for future videos. See you soon, and have nice retro dreams.